April 1945. A single red flag ripples against smoke-blackened sky above the Reichstag, planted by hands that have crawled through 2,000 miles of ashen blood. It is April 30th, 1945, and Berlin is dying. Not the quiet death of exhaustion, but the violent, shrieking death of a beast cornered and torn apart by its own madness. The city that once styled itself the world's next Rome, capital of a 1,000-year empire that promised order and supremacy, has lasted exactly 12 years and 4 months. Now it burns with the peculiar completeness of hubris meeting consequence. Every street a graveyard, every building a broken tooth in the skull of Hitler's dream. The smoke rising from the Chancellery garden carries with it the smell of petrol and burnt flesh. Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun, married yesterday in a concrete bunker 30 feet below ground, are being consumed by flames in a shallow crater. The man who promised Germany its destiny lies crumpled and combusting, while Soviet shells continue their percussion overhead, each explosion punctuating an ending that began, really years ago, perhaps in the frozen mud of Stalingrad. Perhaps in the moment the first transport train pulled away from a provincial station, carrying human cargo to camps whose names will forever synonym hell. Perhaps earlier still, in a beer hall in Munich when rage found language and language found power. But now, in the spring of 1945, endings are all that remain. The soldiers who raised that flag above the Reichstag, Meliton Kantaria and Mikhail Yegorov, though their names will be disputed and their faces replaced in the official photograph, are part of an army that has travelled the entire diameter of human endurance. They belong to the Third Shock Army of the First Belarusian Front, and behind them stretches a trail of devastation so complete that the word war seems insufficient to contain it. They have seen their comrades die in numbers that beggar comprehension. They have seen cities reduced to carbon and memory. They have seen the camps, Majdanek in July of 1944, then Auschwitz in January of 1945, and what they found there cracked something in the architecture of human understanding. Now they fight through Berlin street by street, building by building, room by room. The Germans call it Häuserkampf, house fighting, and it is the most intimate form of industrial killing. Grenades through doorways, machine guns on staircases, flamethrowers in basements where Hitler Youth, children of 15, 14, some barely 12, crouch with Panzerfausts too heavy for their shoulders. The city has become a maze of rubble and improvised fortress, every intersection covered by gunfire, every basement a potential bunker. The Wehrmacht and SS defend with the desperation of men who know what awaits them in Soviet captivity, what awaits Germany in severe hands. They are not wrong to be afraid. The Red Army fights with something beyond tactics, beyond strategy. They fight with the fury of Leningrad, where 1 million civilians starved during the 900-day siege. They fight with the memory of villages burned to ash, of prisoners shot in ditches, of a country that lost 27 million souls to this war, a number so vast it defies emotional comprehension, becoming instead an abstraction that howls behind every pulled trigger. When they reach German soil, discipline fractures. The retribution is terrible. Women pay the price of Wehrmacht crimes in currency of their own blood. The Red Army becomes both liberator and ravager, and the moral clarity of fighting fascism blurs in the smoke of burning Berlin. 3 months earlier, on January 16, 1945, Adolf Hitler descended into his Führerbunker, beneath the Reich Chancellery for the last time. The bunker, 30 rooms spread across 2 levels, reinforced concrete walls 6 feet thick, was built to withstand direct hits from the heaviest bombs. It succeeds at this. It keeps Hitler alive while his empire disintegrates above him. By April, the bunker has become a tomb for the living. 30 feet of earth and concrete separate the Führer from reality, but reality is closing in. The military situation, explained to him twice daily during increasingly surreal briefing sessions, is beyond catastrophic. The Americans and British are across the Rhine. The Soviets are in the suburbs. The vaunted divisions he orders to counterattack exist only on maps. Their men are dead or captured or 16 years old. His hands shake with Parkinson's tremors. His left arm hangs limp. He subsists on injections from Dr. Theodore Morell, a cocktail of amphetamines and opiates that keeps him functional in the way a machine is functional, operational but not human. In the bunker's yellow electric light, time loses meaning. There is no day or night, only the eternal hum of generators and the distant crump of artillery. Hitler's rage at his generals intensifies into incoherence. They are traitors, all of them. The German people themselves are traitors, unworthy of the destiny he offered them. In his final political testament, dictated to his secretary Traudl-Junge with the Red Army half a mile away, he blames everyone. The Jews, the generals, the weak masses, everyone but himself. He orders Admiral Karl Dönitz to continue the war. He expels Göring and Himmler from the party for attempting to negotiate surrender. He marries Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony performed by a minor municipal official dragged from the rubble. Then he retreats to his private quarters with a Walter P. Piercy pistol and a cyanide capsule. The two shots, Eva's pistol, Hitler's, are heard by a few aides but drowned by the artillery barrage. SS guards carry the bodies up the bunker stairs into the Chancellery Garden, now a cratered moonscape. They douse the corpses with petrol from jerry cans and set them alight. The cremation is incomplete. Soviet troops will find the charred remains 3 days later in a shell crater, identify them by dental records, and bury them in secret graves that will be exhumed, moved, and eventually scattered in the Elbe River in 1970. Even in death, Hitler cannot find rest. His body, like his ideology, must be erased so completely that no shrine can ever mark his passing. But Berlin contains millions of others, and their stories lack even the grim clarity of dictator's suicide. There is Hildegard Knef, 19 years old, an actress who will survive the war and later describe the fall of Berlin in her memoir, The Gift Horse. In April 1945, she is trapped in the city, sometimes hiding in basements as shells scream overhead, sometimes venturing out to forage for food among the ruins. She will witness rapes, murders, the casual disintegration of civil order. She will dress as a boy to avoid Soviet soldiers. She will survive, but what she survives will mark her forever, will infuse her later work with a darkness that never quite lifts. There is Gerhard Bold, a captain on the general staff who spends the final days in the Führerbunker, taking notes on the madness. He watches Hitler order phantom divisions to Berlin's rescue. He watches the dictator's hand tremble as it pushes pins across maps where no armies remain. He will escape the bunker on April 29th, making his way through Soviet lines, and will later write a memoir that captures the surreal horror of those last days. The way the secretaries continued to type in perfect German while the ceiling shook with shell fire. The way everyone pretended there was still a future to plan for. There are the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, tens of thousands of German women who will spend the next years literally rebuilding Berlin brick by brick, passing shattered masonry along human chains, clearing 80 million cubic meters of debris. In April 1945, they are simply trying to survive. They huddle in basements while the city tears itself apart above them. They drink water from broken mains and eat whatever can be scrounged. Some have Nazi party members in their families, some do not. All will pay the same price for the regime's collapse. There is Anonymous, the woman who will publish A Woman in Berlin, a diary of the occupation that will not appear until 1954 and will be vilified in Germany for its unflinching description of mass rape. She writes with brutal clarity about the weeks after the shooting stops, when the conquerors exact their revenge and women become the currency of survival. How many times, women ask each other, not did it happen? The trauma is universal, only the details vary. Her diary will be suppressed, denounced as anti-German propaganda or fabrication. It is neither. It is simply true. And there are the children, tens of thousands of them, who watch their world end in fire and noise. They crouch in cellars while their mothers' faces go tight with fear. They learn to distinguish the whistle of incoming shells from the whistle of outgoing. They see things no child should see. Bodies in the streets, buildings collapsing, soldiers dying. Many will survive to build the post-war Germany, carrying these memories like shrapnel in their souls. The battle for Berlin begins in earnest on April 16th, when Marshal Georgy Zhukov launches his assault across the Silo Heights, the last significant defensive position before the capital. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, 6,000 tanks, 40,000 artillery pieces, the largest single military operation in human history, surge westward in the pre-dawn darkness. Zhukov, Stalin's most ruthless and effective commander, orders his troops to mount searchlights on trucks, 143 of them, to blind the German defenders. The effect is hellish. The landscape illuminated in jerking white glare, while artillery pounds the positions, tanks grinding forward through the smoke, men dying by the thousands in the first hours. The German defenders are a mixture of Wehrmacht regulars, Volkssturm militia, old men and boys given rifles and 2 days of training, and SS units that know surrender means death. They fight with the courage of desperation, and for 3 days they hold the Silo Heights against overwhelming odds, inflicting massive casualties. But numbers are inexorable. By April 19th, Soviet forces are through the defences and racing for Berlin proper. From the south, Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front crashes through German lines and turns north toward the capital. The encirclement is inevitable. On April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, spent in the bunker receiving the hollow congratulations of his paladins, Soviet artillery begins shelling central Berlin for the first time. The bombardment is methodical and merciless. Heavy guns positioned in the suburbs reduce entire districts to rubble. The civilians who have not fled cower in basements and U-Bahn tunnels, thousands of them, while the world above them disintegrates. The underground stations become whole cities unto themselves. Children born in the dark, old people dying while the walls shake, families gathering around candles that flicker with each nearby explosion. In the zoo station, animals escape from their bombed cages and wander the tracks. There are stories, perhaps apocryphal but fitting, of exotic birds perched on the shoulders of terrified civilians, of monkeys chattering in the tunnels while shells fall overhead. On April 21st, Soviet artillery shells land on the Reich Chancellery for the first time. Hitler feels the concussion 30 feet below. His world has shrunk to 30 rooms of concrete and delusion. But the delusion is cracking. He asks his architects about construction projects that will never be built, discusses campaigns that will never happen. Those around him humour him, then ignore him, then begin to plan their own escapes. On April 25th, American and Soviet troops meet at the Elbe River near Torgau. Photographs show them shaking hands, smiling, toasting with vodka. The meeting is symbolic. Germany is cut in two. The Third Reich, which Hitler designed to dominate Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, is now a shrinking pocket of Berlin and a few isolated garrisons. The war in Europe is days from conclusion. The street fighting in Berlin is warfare distilled to its most primal essence. Soviet troops advance behind tanks, using them as mobile walls while infantry clears buildings. Flamethrowers scour basements, snipers duel across ruined squares. The Berlin Zoo becomes a battlefield. The anti-aircraft flak tower in the Tiergarten, a massive concrete fortress bristling with guns, holds out to the end, impregnable but irrelevant. The defenders know they are doomed but fight anyway. Some because they believe in the cause, more because they fear capture, most because surrender requires a conscious decision to stop. And in battle, momentum carries you forward even when hope has died. SS units execute suspected deserters on sight. Corpses hang from lampposts with signs around their necks. I was too cowardly to fight for the Führer. These dead men, strangled with piano wire for the crime of wanting to live, embody the final madness of the regime. Even as the edifice crumbles, the machinery of terror grinds on. The civilians suffer most. They are caught between defenders who shoot anyone trying to surrender, and attackers who are often drunk, always angry, and primed for revenge. The Soviet advance is not a clean military operation. It is a tsunami of rage carrying flotsam of humanity. Some officers try to maintain discipline. Many do not. The orders from above are contradictory. Defeat the enemy, but don't destroy the city unnecessarily, except the city is already being destroyed, and the distinction between necessary and unnecessary violence has long since ceased to matter. In the U-Bahn tunnels, someone makes the decision to flood them. Perhaps Wehrmacht engineers seeking to slow the Soviet advance. Perhaps someone in the chaos simply opening the wrong valves. Water from the Landwehr Canal pours into the underground stations. People flee through the darkness as water rises around their knees, their waists. Some tunnels fill completely. The exact death toll will never be known. Hundreds, certainly, trapped in the dark as the water climbs. Those who survive will have nightmares of drowning underground for the rest of their lives. On April 28th, Mussolini is executed by Italian partisans in Como. His body, along with his mistress Clara Petacci's, is hung upside down from a metal girder at a gas station in Milan, where the crowd pelts it with stones and garbage. When Hitler hears the news in the bunker, he becomes obsessed with ensuring his own body will not be displayed. This is why the cremation, why the desperate attempt to erase himself from history even as the flames consume him. On April 30th, as Hitler pulls the trigger in his private room, the battle for the Reichstag reaches its climax. The building has been empty since 1933, when a fire, probably set by the Nazis themselves, gave Hitler the excuse to suspend civil liberties. Now it is simply a symbol, but symbols matter. The Soviets want it. The Germans, or what remains of them, defend it more from habit than conviction. The fighting is room to room, floor to floor. The Reichstag's grand halls, designed to house democratic debate, echo with machine gun fire. Soviet soldiers fight their way up staircases through corridors onto the roof. At some point, possibly April 30th, possibly May 1st, the exact timing is obscured by propaganda and chaos, the red flag is planted on the roof. Yevgeny Khalday, a Soviet photographer, will stage his famous image the next day, carefully composing the shot. Soldier silhouetted against smoke, flag rippling, ruins below. He will later retouch the photo, removing a watch from one soldier's wrist, evidence of looting, and adding more smoke for dramatic effect. The image will become iconic, the Soviet equivalent of Iwo Jima, a stage photograph of a real victory, truth and propaganda so intertwined they cannot be separated. On May 2nd, General Helmuth Weidling, commander of the Berlin defense area, surrenders the city. The fighting stops in stages, some units laying down their arms immediately, others holding out for hours or days in isolated pockets of resistance. The sudden silence is almost worse than the noise. For civilians emerging from basements, the city they knew is gone. Entire blocks have vanished. Landmarks are unrecognizable. The Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, which will later be preserved as a ruin, is a broken tooth of stone. The Brandenburg Gate, riddled with bullet holes, stands sentinel over a landscape of desolation. Berlin's population has been reduced from 4.3 million to approximately 2.8 million. Hundreds of thousands have fled west to escape the Red Army. Tens of thousands have died in the fighting. The survivors now face occupation. The Soviet soldiers who entered Berlin as liberators rapidly become occupiers. Their behaviour ranges from compassionate to monstrous, often in the same individual. They give bread to starving children and rape their mothers. They weep over photographs of their own families and brutalise German families without hesitation. War has eroded the boundaries of civilization, and in Berlin, in those first weeks, there are effectively no rules. The official Soviet policy is to distinguish between Nazis and ordinary Germans. The practical reality is that few soldiers care about such distinctions after what they have seen. For German women, the occupation is an era of survival by any means necessary. They learn quickly that attaching themselves to a single Soviet officer offers more protection than remaining alone. One man's claim is respected where general availability invites assault. They trade sex for food, for protection, for some semblance of safety. The shame is deep and enduring, and when A Woman in Berlin is published in the 1950s, the German response is fury, not at the perpetrators, but at the victim for speaking the truth. The book will be republished only in 2003, after the anonymous author's death. Only then can Germany begin to acknowledge what happened to its women in the spring and summer of 1945. The victors divide Berlin into 4 sectors: American, British, French, and Soviet. The zonal boundaries, drawn with bureaucratic precision, will harden into the front lines of the Cold War. In 1948, Stalin will blockade West Berlin, attempting to starve the western sectors into submission. The Allies will respond with the airlift, flying in supplies for 11 months until Stalin backs down. In 1961, the border between East and West Berlin will become concrete and barbed wire, the most famous symbol of a divided world. The wall will stand for 28 years, outlasting the Soviet Union that built it. But in May 1945, these divisions are still theoretical. What is real is the rubble. What is real are the survivors, picking through the ruins of their lives. What is real are the bodies still buried beneath collapsed buildings, which will be discovered months or years later as the city is slowly excavated from its own destruction. The Nuremberg trials will attempt to assign legal responsibility for what happened here. They will succeed in hanging a dozen men, imprisoning others, establishing precedents in international law that still echo today. But the trials cannot fully capture the diffuse nature of guilt in Nazi Germany. They cannot account for the millions of small collaborations, the thousands of bureaucrats who processed paperwork for genocide, the citizens who looked away or cheered, or simply accepted the new normal until it was too late to object without dying. Hannah Arendt will later write about the banality of evil, the way ordinary people commit extraordinary atrocities through a combination of careerism, obedience, and moral numbness. She will be viciously attacked for suggesting the Holocaust's architects were not demons but humans, as though recognizing their humanity somehow diminishes the magnitude of their crimes. It does not. If anything, it makes the crimes more terrifying. If ordinary people can do this, then we are all potentially capable of it. The lesson of Nazi Germany is not that evil requires monsters, but that it requires only the absence of sufficient resistance. Berlin will rebuild, the Trümmerfrauen will clear the rubble, the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, will transform West Germany into one of Europe's most prosperous nations. East Germany will limp along under Soviet control, building socialism at gunpoint, until 1989, when the wall finally falls and the crowds pour through, dancing on the concrete that imprisoned them. Modern Berlin is a museum of its own history. The bullet-pocked columns of the Alte Museum stand unrepaired, a reminder. The Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church remains in ruins, a broken tower surrounded by modern buildings. The Holocaust Memorial, 2,711 concrete slabs of varying heights, occupies the site near where the bunker once stood. You can walk through it, the slabs rising around you until you are lost in a maze of stone, the city's noise fading to distant murmur. It is intentionally disorienting, intentionally uncomfortable. Memory should be uncomfortable. The bunker itself was sealed and flooded by the Soviets, then later demolished during East German construction projects. Nothing remains but a parking lot and an information placard. There are no pilgrimages, no marker, no gravestone for the man who wanted to rule the world and died in a concrete hole. This is as it should be. What can we learn from Berlin's fall, from this ending written in fire and blood? First, that hubris has consequences, and they fall on everyone, guilty and innocent alike. Hitler's mad dream devoured Germany itself. The people who cheered at the Nuremberg rallies, who gave the Nazi salute, who voted for the party or simply accepted its rule, they paid in full. But so did the people who resisted, the people who objected, the people who were simply unlucky enough to be in the wrong place when history's wheel turned. Second, that vengeance is both inevitable and corrosive. The Red Army's rage was earned by German atrocities in the Soviet Union. The Jewish brigade soldiers who hunted down Nazi war criminals after the war were executing a justice the international system was too slow to provide. But vengeance is fire. It consumes justly and unjustly, and those who wield it are changed by it, scarred even in victory. Third, that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary evil, but also extraordinary resilience. The same citizens who participated in or tolerated the Holocaust rebuilt a democracy from the ruins. The process took generations. It required confronting uncomfortable truths about complicity and guilt. It required teaching new generations a history that made their grandparents look away in shame. Modern Germany's willingness to face its past, to make Holocaust education mandatory, to build memorials to its victims is remarkable precisely because it is difficult. Many nations never manage it. Fourth, that the echoes of 1945 still reverberate. The European Union, at its core, is an attempt to make Berlin 1945 impossible to repeat, to so enmesh European nations in mutual economic dependency that war becomes unthinkable. The United Nations, for all its flaws, grew from the conviction that international law must constrain national sovereignty to prevent another Hitler. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, NATO, the Geneva Conventions, all are scar tissue from the wound of World War II, and Berlin itself, reunified Berlin, is both memorial and promise, a city that destroyed itself in service of the worst ideology humanity has produced now stands as a monument to what comes after. The graffiti-covered remains of the wall, the preserved death strip now a park, the Reichstag with its modern glass dome where visitors can look down on their representatives. These are not just tourist attractions. They are arguments in stone and glass that democracy can survive its own near death, that nations can learn from catastrophe, that history does not have to repeat, but the darkness is never fully vanquished. In our current moment, when autocrats again use nationalist rhetoric to consolidate power, when scapegoating minorities is again politically viable, when alternative facts corrode shared truth, the fall of Berlin speaks to us. It warns that societies can sleepwalk into catastrophe, that democratic norms are fragile, that the slope from rhetoric to violence is shorter than we imagine. The Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers. It began with words, with dehumanizing language, with legislation that stripped rights incrementally, with populations that accepted each new degradation, because, well, it hasn't affected me yet. The camps were the end point of a process that started years earlier, when enough Germans decided that their economic anxiety justified tolerating persecution, that their national pride permitted violence, that their leaders' promises exempted them from moral responsibility. Berlin fell because millions of individual decisions, some made from evil, more made from expedience, most made from simple passivity, accumulated into catastrophe. No single person destroyed Berlin. Millions of people, through action and inaction, destroyed it together. This is the lesson that matters most, that civilization is not a state of being, but a continuous act of maintenance. That democracy dies not in dramatic coups, but in the slow surrender of norms, that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance because the alternative is Berlin in flames. The red flag still flies above the Reichstag, or rather a photograph of it does, reproduced in history books and documentaries. The moment is frozen, soldier triumphant, flag rippling, ruins below. It is an ending that feels inevitable when you know the story, as though Hitler's bunker suicide and Soviet victory were always going to conclude this way, as though history moves on rails toward predetermined destinations. But it did not have to happen this way. Had 1,000 different moments, different choices could have bent the arc. If the Weimar democracy had been more resilient, if economic desperation had not made millions desperate for any solution, if the German people had resisted in numbers large enough to matter, if the Western powers had confronted Hitler's rearmament earlier, if. History is not inevitable. It is made by human choices, millions of them, accumulating into the currents that carry us all. Berlin fell because of choices. Choice to follow a demagogue, choice to persecute neighbours, choice to wage aggressive war, choice to remain silent when speech was still possible. And Berlin rose again because of different choices. Choice to rebuild, to remember, to teach, to refuse to forget, even when forgetting would be more comfortable. The helicopter blade cutting through humid air above Saigon, the red flag rippling above the Reichstag. These images distill complex history into single moments, but the truth is messier, longer, more human. The truth is in the details. The woman in the bunker typing useless memos while the walls shake. The child in the basement learning to distinguish shell types by their sound. The soldier planting a flag on a roof while his comrades are still dying in the rooms below. The truth is that history is not just about the famous moments, the clear images, the decisive dates. It is about what comes before and after, about the slow accumulation of choices that make catastrophe possible, and the slow work of building something better from the ruins. It is about remembering when forgetting would be easier, about learning lessons that each generation must relearn, about staying vigilant when complacency is comfortable. Berlin fell, Berlin rose. The cycle is not inevitable, but it is always possible. The flag above the ruins is both ending and beginning, both judgment and warning. It waves still in memory, in photographs, in the stories we tell ourselves about how nations die, and how they might live again. The smoke has cleared, the rubble is rebuilt, but the lesson remains. Freedom is fragile. Democracy is work. Civilization is a choice we make every day, together. And the price of forgetting is written in the ruins of Berlin, visible still to anyone willing to look, willing to remember, willing to do the work of ensuring that such an ending never comes again. The aftermath. Summer 1945. The smell of Berlin in June. 1945 is something no one who experienced it will ever forget. It is the smell of death on an industrial scale. Corpses decomposing in collapsed basements, in sealed bunkers, under tons of rubble. It is the smell of open sewers, of unwashed humanity packed into overcrowded shelters, of lime spread over mass graves. It is the smell of a city that has died and is only beginning the long, agonizing process of learning to live again. The heat makes it worse. Summer arrives with indifference to human suffering, and the sun that once glinted off the Reich's marble monuments now beats down on shattered stone and reveals horrors the winter darkness had concealed. Work crews, mostly women, discover bodies everywhere. A hand protruding from rubble. A cellar full of civilians who suffocated when the building above them collapsed. Entire families, perfectly preserved by the cool underground, who simply ran out of air. Each discovery must be documented, photographed if possible, buried in the mass graves that ring the city. There is no time for individual mourning. There are too many dead. The survivors exist in a kind of limbo between war and peace. The fighting has stopped, but violence has not. Soviet soldiers, fueled by vodka and rage, continue to terrorize the civilian population. The official ration is 1,240 calories per day for a normal consumer, starvation level, and even that is rarely available. Black markets flourish in the ruins, cigarettes become currency, a pack of Chesterfields worth more than money, which is worthless. Women trade jewellery for potatoes, furniture for bread. Families burn books for warmth, then furniture, then anything that will combust. In the western sectors, where American and British forces are now established, conditions are marginally better. The American GIs arrive with chocolate and chewing gum, symbols of an abundance so vast it can afford to be generous. They are shocked by what they find, not just the physical destruction, which photographs cannot fully capture, but the human devastation. Children with swollen bellies and old faces, women who flinch at any male approach. A population traumatized beyond the capacity of language to express. The Americans have orders to be correct but not friendly. Non-fraternization is official policy. No socializing with Germans, no relationships, no blurring of the line between victor and vanquished. The policy will prove impossible to enforce. By December 1945, it will be quietly abandoned. You cannot occupy a country without engaging with its people, and many American soldiers find it difficult to maintain hatred toward children begging for chocolate, or old women who remind them of their grandmothers. The official narrative, that all Germans were Nazis, that they deserve their suffering, confronts the complicated reality of human beings, who were victims and perpetrators, resistors and collaborators, often in the same family, sometimes in the same person. The question of who was a Nazi becomes urgent and unanswerable. The Allies established denazification programs, requiring every adult to fill out a Fragebogen, a questionnaire detailing their activities during the Reich. Were you a party member? Did you hold an office? Did you participate? The questionnaires are supposed to sort the guilty from the innocent, but the reality is infinitely more complex. The factory worker who joined the party to keep his job. The teacher who taught the curriculum because refusal meant imprisonment. The housewife who gave to party collections because her neighbours were watching. Are they Nazis? The tribunals issue classifications: major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, exonerated. The categories are administratively necessary and morally insufficient. Some justice is achieved. The major war criminals face the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, where evidence of the Holocaust is presented in excruciating detail to a world still struggling to comprehend its magnitude. The photographs from the camps, the testimony of survivors, the meticulous records the Nazis themselves kept. All of it enters the historical record, becoming undeniable proof that will make Holocaust denial difficult, though not impossible. 12 men are sentenced to death by hanging. Hermann Göring, Hitler's designated successor, cheats the gallows by swallowing cyanide hours before his execution. Julius Streicher, publisher of the viciously anti-Semitic Der Stürmer, goes to the scaffold screaming Heil Hitler even as the noose tightens. Rudolf Hess, who flew to Scotland in 1941 in a bizarre solo peace mission, receives life imprisonment and will spend the next 46 years in Spandau prison, ultimately its sole inmate, guarded at tremendous expense until his suicide in 1987. But for every major criminal tried at Nuremberg, thousands of smaller criminals escape. The Cold War is already beginning, and both sides need German expertise. Operation Paperclip brings Nazi scientist to America, Werner von Braun, who built the V-2 rockets with slave labour from Dora Mittelbau concentration camp, becomes the architect of NASA's space program. The Soviets recruit their own Germans, taking entire factories east. In the emerging intelligence war, former Nazis are useful. Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's intelligence chief on the Eastern Front, goes to work for American intelligence. His entire organization absorbed wholesale into what will become the CIA's primary source on the Soviet Union. Morality is a luxury neither superpower can afford when the stakes are global domination. In Berlin, the division deepens. The city becomes a microcosm of the larger conflict. The Soviets blockade the western sectors in 1948, cutting off ground access, gambling that the Allies will either withdraw or concede to Soviet control. Instead, the Allies launched the Berlin Airlift, Rosinenbomber, the Raisin Bombers, Berliners call them, flying in supplies for 11 months. At the operation's peak, planes land at Tempelhof Airport every 30 seconds, delivering everything from coal to candy. The airlift is both humanitarian mission and propaganda victory, demonstrating Western commitment and capability. When Stalin finally backs down in May 1949, the message is clear. Berlin will remain divided, contested, the front line of a Cold War that could turn hot at any moment, the children of ruin. There is a generation of Germans who grew up in Berlin's rubble, and their childhood memories are unlike any before or since. They played in the ruins of Hitler's chancellery, climbed on wrecked tanks, found unexploded ordnance that killed dozens of children each month. They collected shrapnel as other children collect baseball cards. They knew which buildings had basements still full of corpses and which were merely full of rats. This was their normal. Günter Grass, who will win the Nobel Prize for Literature, was 17 when the war ended, a member of the Waffen-SS about which he will remain silent for 60 years. His novels, especially The Tin Drum, capture the grotesque reality of Nazi Germany and its aftermath through surrealist imagery. A boy who refuses to grow, beating a tin drum while history marches past. The grotesquerie is not exaggeration. It is the only adequate language for what happened. Wolf Biermann, born in Hamburg in 1936, loses his Jewish father to Auschwitz. He will move to East Berlin in 1953, become a poet and singer, and eventually be expelled by the communist regime for his criticisms. His songs carry the weight of both totalitarianisms, Nazi and communist, that divided his life and his country. Christa Wolf, who will become East Germany's most celebrated writer, is 16 in 1945 when she flees westward ahead of the Red Army. Her novel, Patterns of Childhood, explores the question of how ordinary Germans could participate in or tolerate Nazism. Searching her own memories for the moment complicity began, she finds no clear answer, only the accumulation of small surrenders. These writers, artists and thinkers emerge from the rubble carrying questions their parents' generation refuses to ask. Why did you not resist? How could you not know? What did you do during the war? The questions create a generational rupture that will explode in the 1960s, when German students, looking at their professors and parents, demand accountability. The revolt of '68 in Germany is partly about Vietnam, partly about general social liberalization, but mostly about the unaddressed trauma of the Nazi past. The students tear down the comfortable fiction that Germany was a nation of resistors or innocents. They force the conversation their elders wanted to avoid, but in the immediate aftermath, in the late 1940s, there is mostly silence. Speaking about what happened is too painful, too incriminating, too complicated. Better to rebuild, to look forward, to pretend the past can be buried like the bodies under the rubble. This silence is corrosive. It seeps into families, creating walls between parents who will not speak and children who cannot understand. It creates a generation raised on lies of omission, who discover the truth from sources outside their homes and feel betrayed. The children of perpetrators carry a unique burden. What do you do when you learn your father was a concentration camp guard? Your grandfather signed deportation orders? Your uncle participated in a massacre? Some deny, some distance, some devote their lives to atonement for crimes they did not commit. There is no guidebook for how to be the child of monsters. German psychiatry will spend decades studying the intergenerational transmission of trauma, not just the trauma of victims, which is more obviously devastating, but the trauma of guilt, which corrodes in different ways. And the children of victims, Jewish survivors who somehow lived and found themselves in post-war Germany, carry their own burdens. Many leave for Israel, America, anywhere but the country that tried to annihilate them. Those who remain do so for complex reasons: family, inertia, the perverse human capacity to make home even in hostile ground. Their children grow up in a country soaked in the blood of their grandparents, navigating an identity that is German and Jewish and hyphenated by Holocaust memory, the two Berlins. By 1949, the division is formalized. The Federal Republic of Germany, democratic and Western aligned, is established in Bonn. The German Democratic Republic, communist and Soviet-controlled, is established in Berlin. The capital of this new East Germany is a paradox, a city divided against itself, where you can stand on one street corner in the west and see into the east, watch people whose circumstances are determined entirely by which side of an arbitrary line they stand on. For 12 years, the border remains porous. Berliners cross back and forth for work, for family, for shopping. But the exodus is one-directional, east to west. The people of the GDR vote with their feet, and by 1961 3 million have fled, draining the country of skilled workers and young people. The communist leadership, pressed by Khrushchev to stop the hemorrhaging, decides on a radical solution. On the night of August 12, 1961, East German soldiers string barbed wire across the sector boundaries. By morning, the wire has become concrete. The Berlin Wall, which will stand for 28 years, goes up in a weekend. Families are split mid-visit. Workers who commuted from east to west find themselves unemployed, unable to return to their jobs. People who went to sleep in one reality wake in another, literally walled in. The wall is not a single structure but a system. 2 walls with a death strip between them, dog runs, vehicle barriers, watchtowers, floodlights, and guards with shoot-to-kill orders. Over the wall's lifetime, at least 140 people will die trying to cross it. Some are shot by border guards, some drown in canals, some die in tunnels that collapse. Each death is documented by the West, memorialized, used as evidence of communism's failure. If your system is so superior, why do you need walls to keep people in? But West Berlin is also a construct, an island of capitalism deep in communist territory, sustained by Western subsidies and political will. It becomes a showplace, deliberately prosperous, deliberately free, a rebuke to the grey austerity of the East. The Kurfürstendamm glitters with neon and commerce. The clubs stay open all night. The universities are hotbeds of radical thought. Easier to be revolutionary when revolution risks nothing, when West German prosperity ensures that even the most anti-capitalist student is fed and housed. East Berlin presents itself as the capital of the true Germany, the anti-fascist state that has learned history's lessons. The propaganda is relentless and partly true. The GDR does purge Nazis more thoroughly than the West, though it replaces them with communists who prove equally adept at authoritarianism. The state builds itself as the antithesis of the Reich. Where the Nazis were militaristic, the GDR is pacifist. Officially, though the Stasi, the secret police, are as militarized as any army. Where the Nazis were individualist, the GDR is collective. Where the Nazis worshipped strength, the GDR worships the worker. But the comparison is complicated by the Stasi, which perfects surveillance to a degree the Gestapo never achieved. By the 1980s, 1 in 50 East Germans is an informer. The Stasi files, opened after reunification, reveal the extent of the paranoia, neighbours informing on neighbours, friends on friends, sometimes family on family. The regime's justification is always security, protecting the socialist state from Western sabotage. The reality is a society where trust becomes impossible, where every conversation might be reported, where the state's reach extends into the most intimate spaces of life. Life in East Berlin is paradoxically normal and absurd. People work, marry, raise children. They find happiness in small spaces, a dacha outside the city, a good bottle of wine obtained through connections, a vacation to the Baltic Sea. They learn to read between the lines of official pronouncements, to understand what can be said and what must remain silent. They develop dark humour. What would happen if the Sahara became socialist? Nothing for the first 50 years, then there would be a shortage of sand. And through it all the wall stands, concrete and wire and ideology made manifest. It appears in films and songs and novels as symbol of division, not just of Germany, but of the world, East versus West, communism versus capitalism, freedom versus security. John Kennedy stands in West Berlin in 1963 and declares, "Ich bin ein Berliner," asserting solidarity. The joke about the phrase meaning "I am a jelly donut" is apocryphal but persistent, like all good myths. Ronald Reagan will stand at the Brandenburg Gate in 1987 and demand Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall. 2 years later, the wall will fall, not torn down but simply opened, overwhelmed by the weight of people who finally stop being afraid. November the 9th, 1989. The date itself is loaded. November 9th is also the anniversary of Kristallnacht, the 1938 pogrom that marked the transition from persecution to extermination. But in 1989, November 9th becomes liberation. The fall happens almost by accident. A bureaucratic error, a spokesperson who misspeaks at a press conference, announcing that travel restrictions are lifted immediately, without delay, when he means to say pending approval. But the words are out, broadcast live, and East Berliners hear them. They come to the checkpoints, first in hundreds, then in thousands. The guards, facing the crowd and receiving no clear orders, hesitate. Then one guard at one crossing opens the gate. The dam breaks. People pour through into West Berlin. Some are crying, some are laughing. Most are simply stunned. They have lived their entire lives with the wall as a fact of nature, as permanent as gravity, and now it is open. West Berliners rush to meet them with champagne and flowers. People climb on top of the wall, dancing, shouting, chiselling away at the concrete with hammers and pickaxes. The images. People standing atop the wall at the Brandenburg Gate, sledgehammers raining down on concrete, become instant iconography of freedom triumphant. But the moment is complicated by what comes next. Reunification is not the easy homecoming people imagine. The economies are wildly mismatched. East Germany's industry is obsolete, its infrastructure crumbling, its currency worthless. When Germany reunifies in October 1990, the East is absorbed by the West in what amounts to economic colonization. Factories close, jobs vanish. The social safety net, one of the few things the GDR did provide, dissolves. Unemployment in the East soars. The West pays for reconstruction through a solidarity surcharge tax that breeds resentment. Many Easterners feel they have traded one form of domination for another. There emerges a phenomenon called nostalgia for the East, among people who lived in the GDR. They miss the sense of community, the slower pace, the security of knowing your place in the system, even if that system was oppressive. They resent being portrayed as backward, provincial, victims who needed saving. They tire of explaining that life under communism was not uniform misery, that there were moments of joy and connection and genuine belief in building something new. The West, meanwhile, struggles with its own reckoning. The comfortable narrative of the good, democratic West, patiently waiting for the evil, communist East to collapse, meets the reality of Westerners who enabled the GDR's survival through trade and loans, who looked the other way at human rights abuses for the sake of stability. The opening of the Stasi files reveals that some prominent West Germans were informers. The moral clarity of the Cold War blurs in the messy reality of reunification. Berlin becomes the capital again in 1999, a decision fraught with symbolism. Returning the government to Berlin is either a statement of confidence, we have learned from history we can be trusted, or a dangerous forgetting, resurrecting the ghosts of centralizing Prussian power. The Reichstag is renovated, crowned with Norman Foster's glass dome that allows citizens to literally look down on their representatives, transparency-made architecture. The city rebuilds, slowly filling in the empty spaces where the wall once stood. But some empty spaces remain deliberately empty. The no man's land where the wall stood becomes parks, memorial sites, spaces of memory. The most famous remaining section of wall becomes the East Side Gallery, covered in murals by artists from around the world. The images range from celebratory to satirical, Brezhnev and Honecker kissing, a Trabant breaking through the wall, abstract expressions of freedom and hope. It becomes a tourist destination, selfie backdrop, Instagram moment. The wall that once killed is now commerce and kitsch. This is either healing or forgetting, depending on who you ask. Berlin, today a city of memory. Walk through Berlin now in 2025, 80 years after the fall, and you walk through layered history. The Stolperstein, stumbling stones, are brass plaques embedded in sidewalks in front of buildings where Holocaust victims lived. Each one bears a name, birth date, deportation date, death date. There are over 75,000 of them across Europe, more than 10,000 in Berlin alone. You walk the city and trip over memory at every corner. The Holocaust Memorial, officially the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, opened in 2005 near the Brandenburg Gate. Peter Eisenman's design, 2,711 concrete slabs of varying heights, is deliberately disorienting. You enter at ground level, the slabs ankle high, and as you walk into the grid they rise around you until they tower overhead, blocking sight lines, creating a maze where you can hear other visitors but not see them. Some slabs tilt slightly, creating an uneasy sensation of instability. There is no single correct path through. The memorial works by making you feel something, unease, confusion, claustrophobia, rather than by didactic instruction. Below the memorial is a museum with rooms dedicated to individual stories, rescuing names and faces from the abstraction of 6 million dead. The topography of terror sits on the site where the Gestapo and SS headquarters once stood. The buildings were destroyed, but the excavated cellars remain, along with a section of the wall. The outdoor exhibition traces the Nazi rise to power and the bureaucratic machinery of genocide with clinical precision. It is deeply uncomfortable, not designed to be comfortable. The site refuses to let you look away. The Jewish Museum, designed by Daniel Libeskind, is architecture as trauma. The building is a fractured Star of David, its zinc facade slashed with random windows. Inside, you walk through spaces that are deliberately wrong. Floors that slant, dead ends, a tower where the only light comes from a slit far above. The Holocaust void is an empty space, unheated, where nothing is displayed because nothing can adequately represent the absence of those who were murdered. You can walk in but not linger. The cold drives you out, a physical manifestation of void. These memorials are confrontational by design. They refuse to let Berlin forget. But they also raise questions. Is memory enough? Does building memorials constitute moral education or moral absolution? Can architecture prevent recurrence, or does it simply mark catastrophe after the fact? Germany's approach to its past is often held up as exemplary. Holocaust education mandatory, denial illegal, memorials everywhere. But even Germany struggles with resurgent nationalism. The Alternative for Germany, AfD, a far-right party, has gained significant support, particularly in the former East. The party traffics in the same grievance politics, the same US versus them rhetoric, the same scapegoating of minorities that greased the Nazi rise to power. History rhymes, even in a nation that has spent 80 years trying to ensure it doesn't repeat. Berlin's immigrant communities, Turkish, Syrian, Afghan, African, navigate a city where the past is inescapable, but not always inclusive. The Holocaust memorials are ubiquitous, but memorials to other victims of German colonialism or other genocides are sparse. The city's memory is selective, and the selection reveals who is considered part of the German story and who remains outside it. Echoes in the present. The fall of Berlin speaks across decades. Its lessons are simultaneously obvious and unlearned. In Ukraine, cities face bombardment reminiscent of Berlin's destruction, and the same questions arise. How do you negotiate with aggression? At what cost is peace worth pursuing? When does appeasement enable further expansion? The ghosts of Munich, 1938, and Yalta, 1945 haunt every diplomatic discussion. In the United States and Europe, democracies confront authoritarian movements within their own borders. Leaders who undermine institutions demonize opponents offer simple solutions to complex problems, demand loyalty over law. The mechanics are familiar from Weimar. Economic anxiety channeled into resentment, resentment into rage, rage into support for strongmen who promise restoration of a mythical past. The Holocaust remains the benchmark for evil, the event against which all other atrocities are measured. But this can be paralyzing. Genocide in Rwanda, in Bosnia, in Darfur, against the Rohingya, against the Uyghurs, each time the international community fails to prevent or adequately respond, the promise of never again rings hollow. The lesson of Berlin is not just about how genocide happens, but about how the world watches and does nothing until it's too late, then builds memorials and promises, again, never again. Berlin also teaches about the possibility of transformation. The city that was the capital of genocide is now a beacon of openness, cosmopolitan, tolerant, committed to human rights. This transformation required generations. It required legal consequences at Nuremberg. It required educational reform that forced Germans to confront their history. It required memorialization that kept memory alive. It required time. But even Germany's example is not replicable everywhere. Germany had the advantage of total military defeat, which left no ambiguity about the regime's evil. It had occupation by powers committed to democratic reconstruction. It had the economic miracle that lifted living standards, making democracy materially rewarding. It had the Cold War, which incentivized the West to invest in West Germany as a bulwark against communism. Most countries attempting democratic transitions lack these conditions. They must navigate competing narratives of history, rival claims to victimhood, incomplete accountability, economic struggle. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Rwanda's Gacaca courts, Argentina's trials of junta members, each represents a different approach to dealing with mass atrocity and state violence. None is perfect. All are necessary. The weight of the past, the red flag above the Reichstag, photographed in 1945, reappears in 2022 in Russian propaganda surrounding the invasion of Ukraine. Russian military bloggers and state media use the image to frame their war as a continuation of the Soviet victory over fascism, with Ukraine cast as the Nazi inheritor and Russia as the liberator. The inversion is grotesque. Russia, the aggressor, claiming the mantle of the Red Army that defeated Hitler, but it demonstrates how history is weaponized, how memory serves power. This is the danger of Berlin's legacy, that its lessons can be twisted to justify anything. Russia uses denazification to excuse invasion. China uses the century of humiliation to justify aggressive nationalism. Every would-be strongman has a story about threatened identity, historical grievance, the need for strength to prevent another disaster. The protective instinct, never again, can become the rationale for preemptive violence. The challenge, then, is to hold multiple truths simultaneously. That the Holocaust was unique in its industrial scale and bureaucratic efficiency, yet all genocides share common features. That Germany's reckoning with its past is admirable, yet incomplete. That memorial and education matter, yet are insufficient without sustained political will to prevent recurrence. That history teaches lessons, yet those lessons are contested and manipulated by every generation. Berlin today is a palimpsest, the city of Frederick the Great, the city of Hitler, the city of division, the city of reunification, the city of immigrants and startups and techno-clubs that never close. All these Berlins coexist in the same physical space, competing for primacy in the story the city tells about itself. The tourist visits the Reichstag and the Holocaust Memorial, takes photos, feels appropriately somber, then goes for cocktails at a rooftop bar where the view encompasses both the memorial and the gleaming modernity of Potsdamer Platz. This juxtaposition, horror and hope, past and present, memory and life, is distinctly Berlin. The city refuses to be only one thing. It is both warning and promise, both cautionary tale and redemption story. Coda, the blade still cuts. A single red flag ripples against smoke-blackened sky above the Reichstag, planted by hands that have crawled through 2,000 miles of ash and blood. The image is frozen in time, but time moves forward. The soldiers in the photograph are dead now, the last of them passing in the 2010s and 2020s, taking their direct memories with them. Soon, There will be no living witnesses to Berlin's fall, just as there are now no living witnesses to the First World War, just as the living memory of the Holocaust is fading as survivors age and die. When direct memory ends, history becomes story, and stories are malleable. This is why the memorials matter, why the archives matter, why the endless documentation and education and remembrance matter, not to keep the past alive, which is impossible, but to keep faith with what happened, to refuse the easy narratives, to resist the comfortable myths. Berlin fell because people chose to let it fall, through a million individual decisions that accumulated into catastrophe. Berlin rose because people chose to rebuild, through a million different individual decisions that accumulated into recovery. The agency is human, always. The forces of history, economic, political, social, create conditions, but people make choices within those conditions. This is the hardest lesson, because it means we are responsible, individually and collectively, for what comes next. The flag still waves in photographs, in documentaries, in history books. The smoke has cleared. The rubble is rebuilt. The survivors are gone or going. But the question the fall of Berlin poses remains, urgent and unanswered. When will you resist? At what point does accommodation become collaboration? When is the moment to stand up, speak out, refuse? These are not abstract questions. They are the live questions of our moment, asked of us as they were asked of Germans in 1933, 1938, 1941. The helicopter blade cuts through humid air above Saigon. The red flag ripples above the Reichstag. The images define eras, capture endings, and they are beautiful in the terrible way that catastrophe is beautiful when viewed from safe distance. But we do not have safe distance. We are always in history, always making choices that will be judged by those who come after, who will look back and wonder, why didn't they see? Why didn't they act? How could they not know? Berlin teaches us that they did see, they did know, and they acted or didn't act, resisted or accommodated, spoke out or stayed silent, each according to their courage and their fear. The outcome was not inevitable. It was made step by step, choice by choice, until the momentum became unstoppable and the city burned. The flag waves, the smoke clears, history moves on, and we remain carrying these stories, bearing these lessons, responsible for ensuring that the ending written in Berlin's ruins, written in ash and blood and the quiet courage of reconstruction, informs the story we write with our own lives, in our own time, under our own fractured sky.